Hi, welcome to Adolf Tolkachev, the Billion-Dollar Spy. I'm Amanda Olkey, Director of Adult Education at the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. Thank you very much for joining us today. Our program is co-sponsored by the Council on Intelligence Issues, some dear old friends. And so over to you, John Gannon.
Thank you, Amanda, so much. Hello and welcome to you all. I'm John Gannon, the chairman of the board of directors of the Council on Intelligence Issues, or CIA as we know it, a nonprofit 501c3 charity that provides free legal information and referral services to CIA and other intelligence community employees. You can find more information about CIA on its website, ciaintelligenceissues.org, including how to make a donation, which of course we would appreciate. We are especially pleased to be collaborating once again with the International Spy Museum as we present a discussion of Adolf Tolkachev's heroic espionage that helped the United States to defeat Soviet mission-critical military technologies in the early 1980s. Three men on our panel today are uniquely qualified to discuss the Tolkachev case. First, we have David Hoffman, who has a long, distinguished career in journalism, including 6 years as the Washington Post's Moscow bureau chief. He is author of 3 acclaimed international security-related books. First in 2002 was Oligarchs, Wealth and Power in Russia. Second, in 2010, he authored The Dead Hand, the untold story of the Cold War arms race and its dangerous legacy, which won him the Pulitzer Prize for general nonfiction. And finally, in 2015, he published The $1 Billion Spy, the true story of Cold War espionage and betrayal, which is still in print and readily purchasable online for those interested in a great read. It will be the centerpiece of our discussion today. When I read the book in 2015, I noted the obvious breadth and depth of David's research and objectivity of his analysis, as well as his brisk and gripping narration of a complicated story. Because I knew some of the CIA officers in the account, however, I especially appreciated having their story brought so vividly into public view. Tolkachev emerges as a noble and exceptionally courageous figure, but he also is seen as in a tight bond with some dedicated CIA officers who applauded his epic successes, but also shared in the nail-biting, life-threatening risks taken to keep him working so productively as he wished. Burton Gerber, always a hands-on case officer, was a strong leader among these officers. Our second panelist today, he retired from CIA in 1995 after a 39 career as a case officer, including as station chief in the USSR during the Tolkachev era. He ably directed the agency's operational programs for the USSR and Europe for 8 tumultuous years during the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe, German unification, the final years of the Soviet Union, and the emergence of conflict in the Balkans, all regions in which he had served with distinction. Over the years, Burton acquired a solid reputation for rigor as a case officer, but also for unusual talent as a seasoned analyst with a keen interest in the people, culture, politics, and language of the countries in which he served. He always sought to adapt and innovate operational strategies to meet unique local conditions and changing U.S. requirements. He also was recognized as a conscientious mentor to young officers. Following retirement, he has written and spoken extensively on intelligence issues and has served as an adjunct professor in the Security Studies program of Georgetown's School of Foreign Service, where he teaches an always fully subscribed course on intelligence ethics. His mentoring skills still at work. Bill Murray is particularly well qualified to serve as our moderator today. He retired in 2005 after a 36-year career in CIA operations, leading agency units and often in Cold War, Middle East, Western Europe, and during the Balkan conflicts in the 1990s. He is a noted authority and public speaker on espionage. After 9/11, he worked on the Senate staff on intelligence reform, which led to the passage of the Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act of 2004. Bill, along with George Jameson, was a co-founder over a decade ago of the voluntary legal referral service for intelligence employees that has become CII. I will now turn over the program to Bill to launch what we know will be a very exciting program. Over to you, Bill.
Thank you, John, for that very generous introduction. Some of you may already be familiar with what we call the Tolkachev case. Some of you may not be. I'll give you a short summary of the case, and then I'm going to ask a series of questions to each of the participants back and forth, trying to give each of them equal time. Adolf Tolkachev was a Soviet radar specialist and researcher who worked at a scientific institute in Moscow. He had access to both current and future details of Soviet design and planning for radar that equipped the Soviet Union's air defenses and both current and planned fighter aircraft, as well as the planned AWACS aircraft. He worked as an agent of the CIA from 1979 until 1985. The material he provided constituted an incredible volume of highly classified documents and other information of very high value. This operation was one of the most important US espionage successes of the late 20th century. The entire operation took place in Moscow, right under the watchful eyes of the KGB. In fact, you'll hear later, I think during the meeting, during the presentation, that at no time were any of the meetings more than 3 miles from the headquarters of the KGB itself. I'd like to begin by asking a question for Burton Gerber. Burton, all through this case, Tolkachev's primary means of copying documents was a Pentax ME camera. He also had a large number of Tropel cameras that he used over the years, but he seemed to prefer the ME camera. Did this bother you? Did you know, as the COS, as the guy responsible for this, how did you feel about this?
The acquisition of information is the goal, of course, of any intelligence operation. And Tolkachev, a volunteer, came to us already with his plan of action as to how he was going to help bring down the Soviet Union by providing valuable information to our government. At the beginning, he used a Pentax camera, which is not spy gear. It's something that any person might have. And he was quite productive with that. His system depended upon his being able to leave his institute at lunchtime, taking with him, secreted on himself, documents which he took home to his apartment, where he photographed these documents, then returned to the Institute with the documents, stored the film rolls securely in his own apartment, and eventually would pass them to us at operational meetings. There came times when we thought it important that he have access to cameras that were not visible as a Pentax is. And so that's when headquarters had already developed the Tropel camera, and we were able to give him a series of Tropels. The diagram here shows exactly how small it was, and it could be used in circumstances when a Pentax would not be at all appropriate. He preferred the Pentax, and I understood that because one, it's not spy gear, and two, it is a familiar camera. Tropel, he had concerns about, as did any of us, that it might malfunction at any time. There came a time when the access that he had to bring documents back home would not work anymore because of new controls within the library of the Institute. And at that time, the Tropel cameras were really important. In those instances, he was photographing sometimes in his office when no one else was, in a shared office when no one else was there. Sometimes he was in the toilet at the Institute. It was a much more awkward situation for him. And it was also a more dangerous situation. There was certainly a danger in taking documents home. What would happen if there were a body check, or what would happen if there were kind of an incident? But over the number of years, that didn't happen. Whereas photographing in the institute itself did present more problems. One of them was a question of light, and we gave him a light meter, of course, and he tried to use that, but that would tell him what was possible and what was allowable for film, but it didn't help him if the lighting he had available was not sufficient. The whole issue emphasizes the question about the central issues of agent operations. What's the security situation? What can the agent possess and use? How can he conceal it both in his own apartment and on his body if he's taking a camera into the institute? And the assessment of that depends on a mutual understanding between the case officer and the agent. It's not going to be imposed on the agent, because obviously it's the agent's life that is at most risk. But his or her viewpoint of what's possible is important. Sometimes, though, we found an agent takes a much more liberal view of what's possible than we did. And we would sometimes be holding back an agent. This became particularly important with Tolkachev because he entered into his work with us with his own plan in terms of how much he was going to produce and when and how often and so forth. And the pace of his production was huge. And sometimes we tried to hold back that pace. But like anything, sometimes, like anything in the spy business, sometimes we then encouraged him to increase his pace because of other events that were happening. So the communication with the agent, meetings with the agent, his production from it, his production for it, are the most sensitive aspects of an agent operation. And Tolkachev was an admirable man in this regard.
Thanks, Bert. Turning to David. David, you had 6 years of experience in Moscow already as a journalist, and you spoke Russian. You authored a Pulitzer Prize winning book on the Cold War arms race, but The $1 Billion Spy was your first foray into the intelligence world. I know that an internal paper written by Barry Royden, intended for use in training, led you to the story. What led you to decide to do the next 6 years of work to turn this into the fine book that it is?
Thanks, Bill. I just want to add something to what Burton said, which is the Pentax ME that was given to Tolkachev was a very, very widespread camera. It would not arouse suspicion in Moscow if a Soviet engineer had one of these. They were made by the millions, and certainly they existed. So Tolkachev took a liking to it to such a degree, photographing those documents on his table at home. And this painting, which now hangs in the old CIA headquarters, is probably the best illustration I've ever seen. But he was so intent on doing this that he broke the camera, and he had to turn it in and said, look, it's not working, I want another one. And he was much less interested in that hard to use little Tropel as he was in the Pentax. But the Tropel was a miracle of engineering. It existed at the time nowhere else in the world. It was made by specialists with incredibly tiny pieces of mechanisms, obviously extremely small, but it had that disadvantage, as Burton suggested, that if Tolkachev were found to have one of those in his pocket at his institute, it was very obviously spy gear and would be very incriminating. So I got interested in this particular case because I had written a previous book about the Cold War, The Dead Hand. And the real motivation of that book was to try to understand the Cold War from both sides. I felt that a lot of the writing and history about it when it was happening failed to grasp the dynamics of the Soviet side. So having been a journalist in Russia, I felt like it was possible when it was over to go back again and ask the question of what really happened. And wow, I found out a lot really happened. The dead hand system itself was a revelation when I began to ask questions and so on. So when that book was finished, this case presented a similar question, which is, was there a history there that we didn't know at the time? And it was that curiosity more than anything else that sort of drove me into it.
Thanks, David. Burton, you already talked quite a bit about the risks involved in this case and some of the problems. We've all faced this problem of dealing with an agent who's a document producer, and that is, how do you get those documents securely? Do you want to make any further comments on some of the special problems that you ran into with this particular case? And then I'd also like to go into the issue of that invisible line across both the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans that we all know about. When you're on one side of that line, you're a field guy or lady. And when you're on the other side of that line, you're a headquarters person. There's a natural dichotomy between the two, and a certain tension that always exists, because one represents official Washington, the other represents what you're trying to accomplish in the field, and there may sometimes be requirements levied on you that you really feel are inappropriate or whatever. Would you want to comment on that in this case? Thanks, Burton.
It's very important to understand that in any agent operation, there's three main participants. There's the agent, of course. Then there's the case officer in the station, in this case, Moscow. And then there's headquarters. And each of those participants may have different views of the operation, of the problems, of the security aspects, of what the reward should be, what is being achieved, what's the value, and so forth. And this, in spy fiction, spy movies, you never get that kind of dynamic of what there's sometimes that tension. Now, being primarily a field case officer, I had the viewpoint that in the field, we were always right. Of course, I had to modify that because I recognized that there were wise men and women supporting our operation in Moscow. And I needed them to support me in very positive ways. And so you want to avoid open opposition, except when clearly necessary. And all three of the times when I was COS, there came a time when I had to say to headquarters, you're wrong, I'm right, I'm doing it. Fortunately, in each of those instances, success followed. Otherwise, I wouldn't probably be here speaking with you right now. In the case of Tolkachev, as I mentioned, he at first came in with certain requirements in terms of money. Headquarters traditionally tries to hold back payments for agents. And my view of it always is, this is less of a problem than you think it is, because almost always, and certainly true for our agents in Moscow, the most of the money is going to go into escrow accounts. It's not going to be given to the agent because of security risk. And so it's not a question of the money clearly in the escrow account belongs to the agent, not to the agency, but it's not a question of security risk. If the agent has received cash from us. The other thing that he had was his own plan, which was fast moving because he wanted to destroy the Soviet Union. And he saw himself, and if you will, as a dissident, but not a dissident who could write the way other people could, but who could provide important information. He realized the value of what he was working on every day at the Institute. The production that he had was primarily film rolls. And when he came, after a case officer agent meeting, the case officer would come in and dump onto my desk 50, 60, 80 rolls of film, which Tolkachev had produced. So the product was something huge. It wasn't product that could be handled through electronic means at that time. Moreover, the product was not timely in the sense that it was going to affect this or that decision being made that week or month in Washington. It was primarily information about Soviet aeronautics plans and activity. And so we could see where Soviet aeronautics, particularly defense aviation, the aviation defense was going. So there was not a timeliness aspect to Tolkachev's production. This is why there came a time when I had to try to resist strongly against my predecessor, who was also now my boss, who is one of the finest case officers I ever met, a man named Gardner Gus Hathaway. But Hathaway had become convinced that we ought to be introducing more into Moscow technical means of communication. Moscow had been an early proponent of such with other agents, which I was familiar with and which we were handling. But I never saw electronic communication as being of value with this agent. I said no, Gus said yes. We went back and forth in the friendly manner. We'd been friends since 1959, so that we could speak honestly and in a way that was respected on both sides. But I did finally agree to test these systems. That proved to be no advance at all in our operation because there was nothing that the agent could provide us electronically in terms of capacity at that time that would take the place of film production. But we gamefully tried to make it work. And I gave up on that system. There were other systems as well that Gus wanted us to try, and we did try them with my being quite reluctant about them. Those systems at that time in that place were not suitable. Nowadays, the systems for electronic transmission of information and so forth would be far more advanced. But in all this, I was always thinking also of what the agent can have. And when we had to give the agent an electronic communications device, that meant more for him to have to hide. It meant more for him if he goes on the street with it to practice it carefully so that it doesn't attract attention. And so this was one of my big concerns about electronic communications in Moscow with him at that time. Does that answer your question, Bill?
Thank you very much. David, I know that you had to slog through 944 declassified operational cables and reams of other material to put this book together. What, if anything, did you learn about U.S. intelligence was surprising or new to you? For example, you had lived and worked in Moscow as a journalist for 6 years. So Soviet paranoia and surveillance was undoubtedly not new to you. Were you surprised to learn that the CIA was able to conduct an operation of this nature with 21 meetings in Moscow itself, all within 3 miles of KGB headquarters, and do so securely?
Yeah, it was surprising, but I didn't realize it right away because I had had that experience in Moscow and traveled there frequently. In working on the book, I decided to try and retrace the steps that Tolkachev had taken with his case officers. I didn't have them all, but I knew some of the places where they met, and one of them happened to be the Moscow Zoo Park. This zoo park, which is partly a zoo and partly just a big park, was located essentially between his institute and his home. So I went there and paid my ticket and tried to walk around and imagine at least the pathways that the case officer and Tolkachev would have taken. And what really hit me was that day, as I stood there on one of those pathways, I looked up and I realized that we were standing within the line of sight of Tolkachev's apartment building window on the 9th floor of that tall tower, which I'll show you right now. It looks like this. I made this photograph myself when I was a correspondent years earlier. Tolkachev lived over on the right hand, my right hand side of this tall Stalin Tower, and on the 9th floor. And the meetings were literally something he could have seen looking out the window. So this tower was particularly special in Moscow because it was built for the elite of the aviation and aeronautics industry. Around the base of it are plaques to famous pilots and test pilots and constructors of famous airplanes. So Tolkachev was sort of nestled in this elite place. And I think, at least for me, to discover that he was meeting with a case officer down below was a testament to everybody's skill and determination to get this right.
Thanks, David. Burton, did you and the others working on this case, and there are a number of people working on this case, I mean, we can't go through the entire list of case officers and others who were involved, but any operation of this type, there's one case officer out in the field with the agent, but there's an entire team of people behind that case officer, something that is sometimes probably not obvious. It certainly is never shown in media or in fiction or anything else, but there's literally a team of hundreds, although in this case, the actual identity of the agent was very closely held within the agency during the time of the meetings. But did you and others working on this case at the time, were you aware of its full significance as you worked on it? I know sometimes we all get so focused on the details and problems of running an operation that the product almost becomes secondary. And I just wondered, what you thought about it as you were going through it. Did you realize that this was something that was going to be determinant for American air superiority for a future generation?
Agent production is, of course, the goal. There's no purpose in recruiting and running an agent if the production is not worth that risk, because there is a risk, particularly for the agent, but also in terms of CIA operations and ability to function and so forth. So production has to be the thing that you're thinking about. In this case, we as case officers, and I think primarily most of the people in CIA, were not able themselves to understand the full value of the rolls of film about the Soviet air defense operations that he provided. The people who could tell us that were, of course, in DOD. Primarily, the customers were the United States Air Force and the aviation part of the United States Navy. And so as we ran through the case, and we in Moscow were forwarding rolls of film where we have not developed them. The film were always developed in Washington. We just forwarded. We did have some idea because of the written materials that the agent had given us of what the value would likely be and in what field it was. We knew that it was particularly in air defense, both the air defense stationary and particularly air defense for the fighter planes. So we knew what the general thing was. Later, the U.S. Air Force would come to us, would come to headquarters, and headquarters would share it with us about the extreme value of this operation. And the title comes, $1 Billion Spy, is actually half right, because the Air Force at one point told us that the information that at that certain time Tolkachev had provided had saved the U.S. Air Force $2 billion in its own research and development expenditures because of knowing what the Soviets were doing. So the value was key to us. We knew it. We knew what the importance of this case. It was also how I justified our risky operation, the risk of our operation, to the ambassador, because he understood full well how important this was to American Defense Department, American Armed Services air defense, air operations. So we understood that we had to make this case work. Everyone in the station participated. My approach to the operation was that everybody knows everything, because I needed everyone, including the communicators and the one secretary and all the case officers, to participate and help plan and come up with ideas that we needed for all aspects of the operation, particularly surveillance detection and how could our case officer get free of surveillance. First of all, be confident that he's free, or get free and then be confident that he's free. We call it operating black. The case officer is black if he's without surveillance. At that time, all my case officers were men, so we would now say he or she. We dealt with the agent in a way to be firm about our own view of the security demands, because sometimes he was more anxious in his production goals than we wanted him to be. And we operated with him always in the concept of trying to help him. He seldom asked for anything once the money issue had been solved, until later on when the issues became very personal, like helping him with some musical CDs for his teenage son, or equipment that could help his son in school, things like that. And these were things that could be obtained on the black market in Moscow. There's a huge black market going on all the time. But we didn't want him operating in the black market. We wanted him doing his job and keeping happy with his family. He had a wife and a son. So we supplied him things like that. And toward the end of the operation, that personal personal needs on his part became more important to him, including literature. He wanted to read dissident literature. And so we were able to give him that rather than having him try to find it on black market, which you could. The samizdat circulated pretty widely. Okay.
Thanks an awful lot, Burton. David, Burton has made a lot of references to the plan that Tolkachev had. And this wasn't on one of the questions that you and I discussed in the past, but I think it's relevant based on what Burton has told us already. Would you go into a little bit the background on why Tolkachev as a person was so disaffected and what he wanted to accomplish?
Yes. Adolf Tolkachev married late. He was in his 30s, and he married Natasha, who he had met at the Institute. She worked in a antenna part of the Institute. He worked on radars. And she had a very, very sad family history. Her parents were both party members during the Great Terror of the late 1930s. And her mother was actually in the ministry and was wrongly accused of subversion, arrested in the middle of the night. And her father was frightened out of his mind. He was a editor of a small paper for light industry, also within the Communist Party. And when they came for her mother that night, her father essentially ran away and hid with friends because he was afraid he was going to be taken, and they found him too. Her mother was executed within a few months, and father sent to the Gulag for 8 years. Natasha was 2 years old when this happened. So she was sent to a state orphanage. This was rather common for the children of those accused. And only later, when she got out and came into adulthood, did she meet her father again. And it was actually in the early 1950s. And he told her the story of what had happened, a horrible story that had left her without her parents. So when she married Tolkachev, I think there was a very deep simmering feelings. Now, in the case of Adolf, we know some things about his motives because of a letter that he wrote to the CIA about those motives. And I think that perhaps at the beginning of his life, he felt some optimism. Many people did about where the Soviet Union was going. And I think even after the war in the 1950s, and especially during the period known as the thaw, Adolf and Natasha had high expectations that things would change for the better. She had endured a lot in terms of her family. Everybody had sacrificed enormously in the war. And there was just a feeling that maybe that was in the past and things would get better. But as time went by, I think Adolf became increasingly convinced that the system was not going to deliver those better times. And as the 60s came, gradually he concluded that it just wasn't going to happen. It wasn't happening. And in fact, the Soviet put down of the Prague Spring and the invasion of Czechoslovakia in August of 1968 was really a turning point for him. It was the moment that he felt that it just wasn't going to happen. And I think Tolkachev was searching for what to do about that. He certainly thought about printing up a flyer and putting it in mailboxes like a open dissident. And he realized as a Soviet radar engineer, that would have probably ended badly. And he didn't do it, but he was very determined to do something. He lived on the 9th floor of that building where he had a shortwave radio, and he would perch it on the windowsill there and occasionally listen to broadcasts. The Voice of America and other international broadcasts were jammed periodically, and times they weren't. And one day Tolkachev was listening when he heard the story of a Soviet fighter pilot in the Far East who had flown his plane to Japan and defected and landed that actually brand new Soviet plane on a Japanese civilian airstrip. and asked to defect. So Tolkachev got an idea in his head that he would defect too, but instead of leaving the Soviet Union, he would defect in place. That inspired him to eventually get his act together, write up a note, create a package, and make an offer to somebody. And then he got to thinking, you know, where would he approach somebody to make this offer? And again, he's just burning with, I would think, sort of anger at the system and what had happened. By the 1970s, shortages were growing in the Soviet, and even in Moscow. So Tolkachev's building, as you'll see from this next slide I want to share with you, was not far from the American Embassy, which is that yellow building in the foreground. And you can see his building in the back. And he would 3 times a week go for a jog around that American Embassy building and then back to his building. Maybe on days it was really cold or rainy, he didn't go. But the militiamen were actually aware, had seen him come many, many times, and they paid him very little heed. But he was looking very, very closely at license plates, because the license plates of the American diplomats' cars had a special tag, and he was looking to see where they parked, where did they drive those cars, because he decided that he wanted to approach somebody, an American. So ultimately, he decided that he was going to approach somebody at this gas station, which was just a block or two away from that tower on the other side from the embassy, because he knew that American diplomats and others would fill up their cars at this particular gas station. So with his package wrapped up, one night he went to that station and stood there. It was about 6 o'clock at night, and it was already dark and cold in January. And he saw the first guy who was there, was just finishing filling up and was getting ready to climb back in his car. And Tolkachev went up to him, and he had rehearsed in his own mind a couple of lines in English. He didn't have a lot of English, but he says, "Are you an American?" And the fellow there said yes. And Tolkachev said, "Can we talk?" And the fellow there says, "Well, it will be difficult." And then Tolkachev says, "Oh, it will be difficult." Those were the 3 lines he had memorized. He put the package on the front seat of the car and walked into the darkness and just disappeared. Well, he didn't know, but he had just approached Bob Fulton, whose picture you see here, who was the chief of station at the time for the CIA, and who then took the package and immediately went back to the station and filed a cable. So there's more to this story, what happened next, but this essentially ends Tolkachev's thinking about it phase. And this was the first act of all this resentment that had built up about what the Soviet system was, what had happened to the thaw, certainly Khrushchev's secret speech denouncing some of the violence of Stalin's era, then the stagnation of the 70s, his just complete fed upness was driving him. And I think Natasha's family history was a factor.
Great, thanks, David. Burton, do you want to add anything to that? You dealt with this case over a long period of time. You've thought a lot about it. You've talked about it. Do you want to add anything to what David said?
Thank you. Yes, Bob Fulton there was a case officer that he and I came in together. We went through training together, and we remained close friends throughout our lives until Bob's recent death. And Bob immediately recognized the value of this. And we're all trained, particularly in these commie countries, to be on the alert for volunteers. Volunteers will occur anytime, any place, any means. And sometimes they're referred to as walk-ins, but I always rejected that word and preferred volunteer, because in a place like Moscow, they aren't likely to walk in and get into the embassy. So they're likely to approach as the way Tolkachev did to Bob at the gas station, or they might leave an envelope in a car or pass something to someone whom they identified as an American on the street. And we had all of those experiences. The initial headquarters response, though, at this time, it was January of 1977, a brand new president, Jimmy Carter, and the proposal from Tolkachev was for a meeting kind of quickly, and it was going to be about the same time when the brand new American Secretary of State would be making his first official visit to Moscow. And everyone, of course, was looking forward to progress in all the issues that divide the United States and the Soviet Union. So headquarters said, no way can we do that action then. And then it came down to the back and forth, with Bob pushing it from his end and with others in headquarters taking the opposite position, that the putative agent, the volunteer, had not yet shown enough of his value, and that it was not feed material, but really important material for the United States. And so there was a period that lasts a couple of years in which there's a bit of a back and forth between headquarters and the station on the one hand, and then the station and Tolkachev on the other, to try to coax out more information. The station officers believed the source was valid. Headquarters was way too cautious, which is one of my fears about headquarters often during my years in working in commie countries. But eventually they came around, and we were able to have our first direct contact with him, with a fluent Russian-speaking case officer named John Gilsher, who deserves a lot of credit for being that first man to bring Tolkachev on board fully. It's important to understand that case officers in a place like Moscow are operating in Russian, and they have to have pretty solid Russian in order to do this, because most agents that we had there spoke Russian. Maybe they might speak some other European language, but English among our agent material, the people who served us as agents, was usually not the language. So case officers had to be fluent in Russian. They had to be fluent in operational judgment, because in our business, it's one case officer out on the street working with one agent. So everyone has to know how to do everything, in effect. They have to be fluent in technology. They have to be fluent in language. They have to be fluent in tradecraft, the business of how we operate so that we keep the agent alive and the KGB mystified. There's a lot that goes into the preparation of a meeting. And I take some of my operational knowledge from a man named Conrad Anker, and probably America's, at least at one time, best known alpinist. And Anker taught me that when you're planning something big, like climbing a mountain, you assemble your team and you get your equipment and you choose your route, and then you rehearse. And I always rehearsed my case officers before they went on any mission. And I rehearsed them with problems, playing the role of the agent. I rehearsed them with problems because, well, we always have on our agenda, we have to keep in mind the agent may have his or her own agenda. And so I wanted the the case officers to get in the practice of recognizing they have to listen as well as speak. We're talking about 5 and 10-minute meetings under darkness in Moscow with the KGB all around. So in other words, it's a high tense situation for everybody. But you find in situations like that, as I did in Moscow and in 2 other commie countries, that while you're nervous as you start up, when you get into the act itself, it's your professional skill that has to take over. And you're not nervous anymore. You're following your instincts for what a case officer does. Hope that helps, Bill.
Very good. Thanks, Burton. David, Tolkachev was an engineer and he was primarily involved in radar during his career, but there's a lot of latitude to that. I mean, there are a lot of other things that go into an aircraft besides radar, but his career was radar. What do you believe were the most important technical secrets we learned through this operation? And how do you believe they influenced the development of U.S. technology? And I'd like to put in a plug at some point in time for the role of intelligence as it applies to the safety of America and the United States, but also, intelligence spurs research and development in the United States. It's good for business too. A part of intelligence that's frequently missed. This guy this agent produced reams and reams of data, which then had an effect on U.S. development and engineering, research, development, engineering through the next 20 to 25 years. So David, how do you view all of this? What did you see how it was affecting U.S. technology?
I'm going to answer that, but first I want to put in a plug of my own, and that's for Burton. Although I think he's too modest to say so, from my reporting, it is quite clear that Burton Gerber, as chief of station, not only did he train, but he actually choreographed. And Burton is described by those who worked with him as an obsessive perfectionist. And I don't know very many places in the government. Obviously, there's all kinds of people who work for government, but one of the things that I learned in doing this book was how intense the training and efforts were with every operation to make it perfect. And it's quite extraordinary. I've been covering politics for years. I've covered foreign policy. I've been a foreign correspondent. I've been an editor during wartime. And I was quite impressed at the extraordinary efforts that were made with every single step of this operation. And Burton was a big part of the inspiration. When John Gilsha was out there on the street, John had never done this before. And the subsequent case officers, there was an enormous amount at stake, but they had essentially pursued this goal of doing it perfectly, thanks to Burton. So what Tolkachev compromised, you have to remember the Soviet Union had the largest borders in the world. They had an enormous country to protect. And although much of the talk in the Reagan years about the Cold War was about nuclear weapons, missiles and the MX and so on, a very serious and important part of that was air defenses, because the Soviet Union did not have, they had so many borders to protect. We were lucky. We had a continent that was oceans away and was different. So to protect it, they invested enormous amounts on land and in the air with air defenses, which is both offensive weapons and radars. And Burton has mentioned that Tolkachev had a plan. He actually said that in 12 years, he was going to basically provide everything there was about Soviet air defenses, a plan that he overfulfilled. He did it in fewer than that. He did it in about 5 years. So the design and capability of all the Soviet radars that were on its various aircraft, the radars called the Safir and the Zaslon were particularly important. And these were in the MiG-25, the MiG-23, the MiG-31, the MiG-29, and the Sukhoi 27. Over and over again, these were blueprints that once the United States could begin to examine them, and we did, then we could understand the eyes and ears. If the Cold War had ever become hot, it would have been vital to know the capabilities of these radars that would be in Soviet planes. But of course, by taking them apart and understanding these blueprints, we were able to make really important conclusions about Soviet capabilities. I just like to mention one or two of them that came about, not only because of the actual radars, but we began to realize the Soviets were struggling to create a look-down radar capability. In other words, to see a fast-moving object against the pattern of the Earth. And that object, from their point of view, might be an incoming cruise missile as well as an aircraft. And they were having trouble with that. And the CIA produced a couple of estimates over many years, grappling with the question of, did they have this or not? How far along were they? It was really kind of a hole in our understanding. I read those estimates and I came away thinking that we just didn't really know. And even at the time of the famous Team A and Team B exercise of the 1970s, if you look at the records there, you'll see that this was a big hole in our understanding. So when Tolkachev came along, he explained the Soviet air defenses were weak. They did not have an answer to look down radar, and they were working hard on it. So they did make progress, and Tolkachev continued to compromise those systems so that by the time the Soviets fielded their AWACS, their airborne warning system, we already were ready to compromise it and understood its capabilities. And in fact, this led to one more technological achievement that was a radar jammer that the Air Force and the Navy were building at the time. And if you look at the records of this jammer, you'll see we were a little puzzled because the Soviets were trying to understand pulse Doppler technology, which was very important technology for the look down and for other kinds of radar. And by the materials that Tolkachev brought in, we were able to build capabilities that would spoof their radars. In other words, we could make our planes just disappear off of their screen. We could mislead the Soviet planes. So that kind of work grew out of the things that Tolkachev brought to people for research and engineering. I don't know, to be honest, Bill, if any of this ever produced any value in the civilian sphere, but the people that I've talked to say that this was an extraordinary advantage in air defenses, and it essentially led to a vast improvement in the air superiority of American forces by the early 1990s.
Thanks, David. Burton, case officers of my generation, and I was probably about 10 years after you. I think I came into the agency about 10 years after you did. We were all familiar with the Gerber rules, which was sort of a shorthand for your attitude toward how we should handle potential defectors, walk-ins, volunteers, et cetera, in Moscow. And I'd like to ask you to enlarge on that a little bit, but I'd also like to ask you, you've already referred to, and David both referred to the planning that goes into operations, something that you and I are very familiar with. That was especially difficult in Moscow because you didn't even have street maps that you could use that were of any value. I've been in a lot of countries like that, actually. In some places, there simply were no street maps. How did you find that challenge, and how did you master that challenge?
What you refer to as Gerber rules is basically from a study I did when in headquarters back in the early 70s, when I became concerned that volunteers in Moscow were generally not being accepted, being rejected, being ignored. And often with the supposition that they were plants by the KGB to provoke us. often I tried to ban the word provocation, by the way, in my presence, because I thought it was used way too much. So I studied these cases, or studied these opportunities, they weren't cases, and wrote them all up, and then sat there and thought about them. And then I came to a conclusion. And this conclusion was one that was contrary to lots of people's thinking, and is that we should be more aggressive in responding positively to volunteers in Moscow. We can talk about it now because it's been in books, and it's been discussed by the Soviets, because clearly the American traitor Aldrich Ames later on would have passed that approach, my approach. He would have passed that on to the Soviets. So we can talk about it openly at this stage. But at that time, my view was that the important thing with a volunteer is, did she or he approach us in a manner that probably was not visible to the opposition, to the KGB or the militias or nosy Soviet citizens? Secondly, did the volunteer provide some data? Didn't have to be a lot, but some data to indicate that the person was from an interesting position and had access to interesting data, interesting information. Thirdly, was there some means to recontact? Maybe the person proposed another meeting at the same place in a week, or maybe proposed a phone number or something like that. Then I used my judgment. I'd been around by the time I was doing this study, and then by the time I was COS Moscow, I had had considerable experience working against commie countries, particularly the Soviet Union. And I was using my own judgment, fortified by discussing it with senior colleagues as appropriate, as to when it's appropriate to pick up such an offer. And in Moscow, where we don't have the means, in those days, we did not have the means to spot, develop, assess, manipulate, and recruit an agent in the normal kind of way that we might in other places in the world. The way we would get fresh blood would be volunteers. And during my time in Moscow, we reacted aggressively in that regard and had some very good sources through that. So the rule is to be aggressive, look for secure approach, look for indication that the person does have information of interest, and then look for the means to contact this person securely. And we did it in a variety of ways, sometimes showing up again where the volunteer first approached us, sometimes by making a phone call. And sometimes I was wrong, but I was not wrong in a way that compromised our ability to operate in Moscow. I was wrong in terms of the person that I thought might have something of value did not. But I'd rather err that way than miss good opportunities like Tolkachev.
Thanks, Burton. And before we leave you completely, because we're getting down to it's 1:06, we want to leave. There's one more question for David, and then we want to leave time for questions at the end. I think it's appropriate to ask you at this point in time, how was Tolkachev eventually exposed, and what happened to him?
Tolkachev was betrayed, in best of our judgment, by a CIA traitor, a man who had been trained to take over and take a position in Moscow Station, and therefore had been briefed on a number of operations, not knowing names, but knowing circumstances. And that man, whose assignment was canceled shortly before he was to leave for Moscow, was bitter. And we know from various information that he approached the Soviets and at certain dates. And I can pinpoint probably the one time, the one particular operational meeting that he had with the Soviets when he betrayed Tolkachev. He wouldn't have known Tolkachev's name, but he would have known enough details that the Soviets could then have followed up with their analysis and then gotten to Tolkachev. So the man who betrayed him, we believe, was a man named Howard. He is now deceased. He escaped from the United States when he first came under suspicion, and he eventually died in Moscow.
Thanks. David, you put up a slide a few seconds ago. I'm not sure everybody realized that that was the actual arrest of Tolkachev. And for those of you who don't know, it was followed by the usual Soviet internal trial and execution. A very valuable human being was lost. David, going over to you in the few minutes that we have left here. David, you have a particular mathematics that you worked out on U.S. Interactions with Soviet aircraft. Can you give us an insight into that? Numbers lost in various encounters over the years.
Yeah, you know, the United States has not always enjoyed air superiority, and certainly in Vietnam, the record was not good. And I think after Vietnam, a lot of people were giving thought to this problem that we had lost a lot of aircraft in combat. And if you recall, in the late 60s, that people were really down on the Air Force because of this. And so this sort of gestation was going on. What do we do about that? And then by the time that Tolkachev begins to come in essentially 79, 1980, 81, this designers and people are beginning to move into the phase of doing something about air superiority. And in fact, the F-15 was largely a result of that, and certainly in its later issues, F-15C and E. And Tolkachev essentially brought the kind of drawings and intelligence from the Soviet side that allowed the United States to build the electronics and avionics for combat aircraft that vastly improved our ability to maintain air superiority. So the next test case of this comes in the Persian Gulf War in the early 1990s and you see at that time our pilots were flying against Soviet-built MiGs, and we enjoyed almost complete air superiority in that war. I mean, almost absolutely. I don't remember the number; it's in the book, but this change was obviously due to the designers and engineers in the United States, but it was also due to the fact that we were reading the mail of the Soviet designers and looking at their blueprints.
I think since Tolkachev's period, the record has been 48-0. Well, thank you very much, everybody. We're at 1:11. I'd like to turn over to Amanda. She's going to handle some questions. Amanda?
Hi, very fascinating conversation, and we have a lot of questions, and David answered some directly, which we appreciated. But folks really want to know what happened to Tolkachev's wife and child after he was executed. That is a repeat question.
I'll answer that. So Tolkachev was arrested, tried, and executed for treason. And his wife at the time was Natasha had discovered Tolkachev's spying about halfway through. It actually happened one day when she opened the drawer and saw that Pentax camera or something. And she said to him, Adolf, you know, I share your antipathy about the Soviet system. I understand why you're doing this, but I don't want what happened to my family, my parents, to happen to us with our family. So please stop, because I don't want anything to happen to our family. Well, Tolkachev promised he would stop, but he didn't. And after the case was discovered, after he was betrayed and he was arrested, Natasha was also prosecuted. And I think they pulled a trick on her, that they told her if she confessed everything, she would get off. And instead, she was given a 3-year sentence in a hard labor camp. After 1 year in this camp in Bashkortostan, she was then moved to a lesser difficult labor camp closer to Moscow. And in the 3rd year, she was amnestied as part of a general amnesty. And of course, she came back to Moscow broken by the experience. She couldn't find work. And, you know, it was a very, very difficult time in her life. And then she developed cancer and she passed away. Their son lived in Moscow. He became a successful architect, which was his career goal. I think the kind of architecture he had to do was somewhat limited, and he began to think about working with foreign architects so he could learn more ambitious skills and projects. The interesting thing to me is that the son was not asked to pay a price for what his father did. Natasha did.
And a lot of people are focused on the escrow account, the possible escrow account of the money that the CIA was keeping for Tolkachev. Could the son access it? Does it exist? Does anyone know? And there were just so many questions about that I had to ask.
Is that a question, hey?
Is there an escrow account? Could the son access it?
There is an escrow account, and it belongs to his heirs, and it's available to them when possible.
Yeah, great. Burton, while you are leaning in, a guest wants to know how much you feel Tolkachev's work contributed to the fall of the Soviet Union.
I don't think that Tolkachev's information contributed to that, beyond the fact that whenever we engaged the Soviet military technology, such as in the first Gulf War, when we were so successful with that, the Soviet military was shown to be not as perfect as the society, as the government tried to convince the people it was. So his value was to our defense. It wasn't to undermining the strength of the Soviet, the communist state itself.
Okay, you are all going to want to respond to this. We've talked about this previously, but we've had several questions about it, and it was mentioned lightly. But there are some assertions out there that Tolkachev was a dangle or a provocation, and you did mention it, but do you want to state more emphatically, in particular, you know, former CIA historian who has mentioned that?
based on the information that we have had from Tolkachev, I think there's no doubt that that was information that seriously damaged the Soviet Union by giving us advantages in terms of countering Soviet air defense and Soviet fighter tactics, for instance, and that came through during that first Gulf War. There's no doubt in my mind that over those productive years of the operation, that Tolkachev was dealing with us as an agent, and that the KGB was not in any way sponsoring this.
All right. Anybody else want to comment on that?
You know, it's just also when you look at the quality of the stuff that he delivered, you have to ask the question, if he was a dangle, why would they essentially shovel out the entire secret history of their air defenses so critical to the country for a dangle? No, he was not. They did not want this material in the hands of the United States.
Thank you. Okay, this is a broader question and very interesting one, I think, about the emotional connection between a case officer and an agent, and how do you maintain that emotional distance when the stakes are so high, as we see Tolkachev paying the ultimate price?
That's very crucial, and particularly because while it's one agent, over the years of the operation, it's several different case officers who obviously have different personalities, of different ages, different backgrounds, and so forth. Which is why it's so important that we maintain a consistency in our devotion to making the operation work. It's very important for every case officer, succeeding case officer, to know exactly what had happened already, to know what his desires were, to know what he expected from us. That's why the agent, of course, knows the history of the operation because he's there for all 6 or 7 years. The case officer is coming in for 2 years, maybe. So I always made sure that the case officers had studied that file and knew all the aspects, all the wrinkles, all the stresses, and all the pleasures of that operation. At each meeting, in addition to the personal tie that occurred, we also passed to the agent what we called an operational letter. And that letter dealt, of course, with operational issues and production issues and things like that. But it also dealt with his concerns and trying to make sure that he felt he was part of us, and that he continued to feel that. So that was always an important part. And I found that the succeeding case officers over the time that I was concerned with this case were very good building on that firm basis that John Gilsher had started with, and then was followed on by David Rolfe.
David, question for you. Did you have Russian sources for your book? And did they give you a different perspective into the case?
I worked in Russia as a journalist and have been back frequently. And so I made every effort I could on those reporting trips to check facts and verify the things. And especially I was interested in the positive intelligence. So I went to Tolkachev's Institute. I looked at the radars. I did everything I could. I walked the walk from his institute that he took back to his apartment. I timed it. I tried to understand what he was going through. So I feel that part of the basis of the book are these declassified documents, which are the record of the case. I did not want to call up the former KGB and ask for their archives. But and some of them have published their various versions, and I'll leave that to the readers to judge. But I did feel an obligation and did make an effort to check the checkable facts, to verify things, to understand things. I'll give you just one example. Tolkachev repeatedly asked the CIA to replicate his building pass so that he could leave it in a box while he was going home for lunch and have another one as a spare to check out the documents. And the CIA eventually did that. And it took a long time, 4 tries. And eventually they produced this one that was indistinguishable from the real building pass. And this process of doing this was long and difficult. And finally, it was overtaken by events when the Institute changed its procedure. But the reason I mention this is that one of the puzzles to me was, why did the Institute change the procedure? Why did they essentially, for a period there, they relaxed it and let him go out to lunch and come back with all this stuff right in his coat pocket? Well, the answer, which you will get from reporting in Russia, is that there were many women who worked in the libraries, and especially the secret library at his institute, worked in the various departments, and it was necessary for them to get out on the street for hours at the lunch hour, basically to wait in line for scarce goods, to wait in line for food and for clothing. And they insisted that the system be created that they could go out at lunch. And so essentially the whole system was changed to accommodate the demands of a shortage economy. And Burton, I think, correctly answered your question about the collapse of the Soviet Union. But if you read the book, you'll see that in many ways, Tolkachev was pushed by a hidden hand of a dying system. Not only his own feeling of disenchantment, but all around him, the various things that enabled this to happen were part of a system that was slowly, gradually failing. And certainly the business with the building pass, which was key to his ability to take all those documents home, was just due to the fact that there weren't enough shoes and there wasn't enough bread, and people had to wait in line for hours and hours.
Did he ever have any second thoughts? Did he ever have to be talked back into doing this work for us?
Burton, if you don't mind, I'll answer briefly. As far as I can tell from the record, he had no ever doubted his own motives at all. He had many, many zigs and zags in terms of his desires and the things he wanted. From the issue of money, there was a misunderstanding about money at one point. Then there was the question of exfiltration. Did he want it to be exfiltrated? At one point, he wanted it very much. Another point, when a plan was prepared, he basically handed it back and said, no, I can't do it. And at a third point, he had a fantasy that the CIA could bring a glider into his dacha and just fly him out of the heavily air-defended Soviet Union. So he had a lot of moods, and even though he was a very sober fellow and an engineer, he very much wanted to get something out of this to please his son. And one of the case officers describes in the book this very, very important moment when Tolkachev hands over the rolls of film, and the case officer brings for him rock music, 12 albums that were requested by Oleg. And this was the moment, the case officer said, the one moment that he saw Tolkachev's eyes light up in a huge sense of satisfaction. His payoff was to deliver to his son, albums from Uriah Heep.
Did Tolkachev request and receive an L pill?
Yes, this is always a controversial issue in our service. And sometimes when people have asked me if I ever had to do something that was contrary to my moral convictions, I respond there's only one time, and it was this. Tolkachev asked early for an L pill. L stands for lethal. The response from headquarters was negative, strongly negative. Something like that has to go to the director himself or herself. When I took over from Gus, this issue was still there, and he would bring it up, the agent would bring it up from time to time. And I went to bat, in effect, for him. And I pushed headquarters to approve it. And my reasoning was that whereas he was a volunteer, we didn't bring him in, but we have kept up the contact with him. We're now responsible for his security and life. And if he feels more confident being able to resist torture by being able to take an L pill, I think we owe it to him. So I pushed enough that eventually the director approved it, and we did give the agent the L pill. It violated my own religious belief, which is why I say it's the contrary to my my moral code. But sometimes I guess even a case officer faces that.
Burton, while you're speaking along those lines about moral codes, this question came in really early, so it will be our last one. Do American officers ever have trouble recruiting and working closely with people who are willingly betraying their own country?
Well, our goal is to defend the United States, to provide information for the national security of the United States. This means there's a whole lot of things that, a whole lot of government installations, government institutions, which are following this course. CIA Directorate of Operations is generally trying to do this either through espionage or through technical collection. And espionage requires recruiting people to spy for us, to betray their own country or their own group. But keep in mind that the motivations for these people are often very noble ones. We're not using blackmail, we're not using threats. We try to make any operation based on positive connections. Take Tolkachev, a man who despised what the Soviet government, the Soviet Communist Party had become and wanted to change. And that was often the case in the Soviet Union. So working with those people, we actually viewed them as heroes. We didn't view them as traitors or as people who had betrayed their country. We viewed them as people who were helping the defense of the United States.
Well, this has been incredibly meaningful. There are so many questions, and we will do our best to share them with the panel after the program if they are willing to follow up. They are such wonderful resources. I have a feeling that they just might do that. Before I turn this over to Bill to say goodbye on behalf of the Council on Intelligence Issues, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Take care.